Hello everyone, Professor Krislik here. So, although it's not front page of the news right now due to the protests in California and Los Angeles, tariffs are still something going on behind the scenes. Discussion between the Trump administration and China, and really every country around the world having discussions about tariffs. So, although these tariffs aren't front and center in the news anymore, um, these negotiations, these discussions are still going on, and I thought this would then be a good opportunity to think about last time that the Trump administration in his first term put tariffs, put steel tariffs, put aluminum tariffs, and how those tariffs worked out. Were they successful? Did they successfully increase steel production? So I made a video in the past with thinking about, okay, where are those jobs if they do come back? Where will those steel jobs go? Today I wanted to talk a bit about, okay, do tariffs from the past create jobs? Do they create jobs in the steel industry? So in 2018, President Trump imposed 25% tariffs on steel and 10% tariffs on aluminum imports, and he cited national security, saying it was a national security risk not to have as much steel production in the United States. Although that was 2018, today we hear very similar rhetoric. Is it the Trump administration says bringing jobs back to the United States, creating national security, having national security implications by not creating as much steel here. So I wanted to think about, okay, well, were those tariffs successful in bringing back jobs? And in the steel industry, we see some interesting results. So the Peterson Institute for International Economics has did some interesting studies on this. Planet Money has did some interesting studies. The Daily had ran a story talking about, okay, well, what happened last time there were these tariffs from the Trump administration? So did they create more jobs? Did they increase steel production? So let's think first about the steel output, steel production. And what we see is between 2017, before the tariffs, into 2018, and into 2019, a year after the steel tariffs, we actually did see an increase in steel output, steel production in the United States. In 2017, steel output went from 81.6 million tons 2018 to 86.6 million tons, and then in 2019 87.8 million tons. So about a 7.5% increase in 2 years. So the Trump administration argued that this was a success. Look, we are bringing back more steel production to the U.S. And if you look at steel production, it went up. This also then, because domestic industries were protected from that international trade, the international trade of cheaper steel coming into the United States, the domestic cost of steel also went up from a decent amount, about 20-30%. Some estimates show that the price of steel went up from 2017 to 2018 to 2019, depending on what month and when you're trying to capture the data. But what we do know is that it was an increase in price. So this increase in price that domestic manufacturers could charge then incentivized more increased domestic production. Some plants that had been idled in Ohio or Pennsylvania were either expanded, maybe their working hours were expanded, or maybe plants reopened. So we saw that if we're just trying to capture steel output and steel price, the tariffs appeared to be successful, at least at first. So after peaking in 2019, steel output dropped again. So we know the global pandemic, of course, had an impact on this. The COVID-19 pandemic had an impact on industries across the world. But by 2023, production had fallen back below 2017 levels at about 80 million tons. Uh, Although many of these Trump tariffs remained in place. So of course, the global supply adjustments, COVID-19 era shocks contributed to these reversals. But the big takeaways in the short run, there was an increase in steel production. But in the long run, there was not. The tariffs were less effective over time as steel consuming industries either adapted, found new suppliers, maybe countries that the tariffs weren't being as impacted. The tariffs didn't impact those imports as much. So that, of course, is one way that businesses worked around tariffs. Again, the Peterson Institute for International Economics has did some pretty good analysis on this, and they continue to do it today. You can go to their website and track all of the new tariffs being put on. They have a section called Trump's Trade War Timeline 2.0, an up-to-date guide, which really lays out a lot of what we're talking about today and more recent, like day-to-day things, not just looking in the past of 2018. So if we saw some short-term gains in output, what did that have to do with jobs? Okay, so there were actually some modest gains. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, of between 4,500 and 6,000 new steel jobs were created between March 2018 and 2019. So that's about a 6%, again, depending on what months you're looking at. About a 6% growth in employment in the steel manufacturing sector. Some companies like U.S. Steel actually started to do pretty well. So I mentioned expanding plants or reopening plants. U.S. Steel was one of the key drivers of that. Bringing on steel workers, reopening plants, maybe a new shift, maybe expanding a shift. So we see that there was an increase in steel production and an increase in steel workers. So to the steel industry, that looked pretty good. Maybe a new factory, a new branch of a factory that had been closed, opening, bringing on new hires, increased output. To the steel industry, things were looking up. So when we think about public policy, it oftentimes if public policy is favorable to you, it often depends on where you sit. So if you're in the steel industry in the U.S., the public policy of tariffs might look good. It might have expanded your production. It might have helped your industry. However, when we look at some of the downstream industries, higher costs from tariffs absolutely played a negative role. So depending on where you sit, in the steel industry, the tariffs looked good. If you are an industry that requires steel or aluminum, your situation was not nearly as good. So industries that were reliant on steel, on aluminum, such as automobiles, construction, heavy machinery, appliance, they all faced rising costs. So to the steel industry, things are going well. High price here in the U.S., a positive. For people that require that steel, require that aluminum, all of a sudden you had to pay more. And so the Peterson Institute for International Economics, which I keep referencing, argued that tariffs raised U.S. steel prices about 19 or 20%. They argued that U.S. consumers and businesses paid an additional $5.6 billion more for steel in 2018. So steel producers gained about $2.4 million, meaning the downstream industries subsidized those profits. So again, if you're in the steel industry, things are looking good. But if you require that steel, that you no longer have access to cheaper international steel, that's a negative for your industry. And then in turn, you have to raise the price. And so if we're thinking about tariffs, we're thinking that they're a national security issue. Maybe it doesn't matter if the prices are higher downstream. But just thinking about, okay, consumers want affordable goods. Consumers want to be able to afford new dryers or new wash machines when there's break. That these higher prices, setting aside national security issues, these higher prices impact the consumer. And by 2019, the Federal Reserve estimated that about 75,000 manufacturing, so not in the steel industry, but downstream manufacturing jobs, may have been lost due to higher input costs, supply chain disruptions, and foreign retaliation, which we won't dive into in this video. But we see from these tariffs that maybe created a few thousand steel jobs had downstream impacts that led to about, again, if we listen to the numbers from the Federal Reserve, led to about 75,000 job losses in other sectors of manufacturing. So these industries are pretty hard hit. So one example that is oftentimes cited is the car industry. Automobile makers like Ford, GM, Tesla said tariffs raised their import costs by hundreds of millions of dollars annually. Ford, for example, claimed that in late 2018 that tariffs added about $1 billion of additional costs. This reduced profitability for the company, pushed up vehicle prices for consumers, and slowed hiring or investment in some cases. Another example that is oftentimes used because it impacts consumers a lot are things like appliances. Companies like Whirlpool initially supported the tariffs because they thought it would help their industries, but they eventually struggled with rising steel costs. Appliance prices rose about 10 to 15% with costs passed on to consumers. So we see this discussion today about who will pay the tariffs. Tariffs, those fees are pushed onto consumers. Even if it's not 100% of the tariff being pushed onto the consumer, the majority of the price and the cost is pushed onto the consumer. So we saw this in 2018 with automobiles, with appliances. Things that people want to buy, things that people need to live a comfortable lives, those prices went up. So when we think about are tariffs good or bad, the conventional view from economists is they might have a role to play in some instances, but in general, if we think about the pros and cons, it often depends, again, on where you sit. If you're in the steel manufacturing industry and your industry is growing, maybe you're happy about the tariffs. But if you're in those downstream industries where all of a sudden now making your wash machine costs more, well, that means the consumer will be less likely to buy a new wash machine until they absolutely have to. So that hurts your sales. Or cars, if cars go up 10-15%, well, then consumers are less likely to buy a new car until they need to. So when we talk about tariffs, we see that it is this interplay of protecting some industries while other industries are hurt. So for the 2018 steel tariffs that Trump put on, and steel and aluminum, the short term was positive. It boosted production. It led to higher prices in the steel industry, higher profits. It created again between 4,500 and 6,000 jobs. But those weren't long-lasting impacts, even when many of the tariffs remained in place. And then when we looked at manufacturing and construction downstream, there were about 75,000 jobs lost. There were higher prices on cars, higher prices on appliances, things that people need for a comfortable life. Okay, so if you made it to the end, thank you for watching. Again, just to recap, the Peterson Institute for International Economics does a lot of good stuff on tariffs, talking about tariffs, trying to educate the public about what are going on with tariffs, and maybe a way that if we're just reading the news or listening to the news, we don't necessarily follow tariffs every day, but they do a good job of tracking it. Also, I just wanted to talk about the 2018 tariffs, because when we think, well, okay, how will tariffs impact the economy and consumers today, we don't have to look that far back into history to see what happened the first time the Trump administration put tariffs on steel. And when I make these videos, I'm not advocating that tariffs are good or that tariffs are bad. Simply, we just want to understand that there are oftentimes, if not always, unintended consequences for public policy. So it might seem positive that we're protecting steel industry. And again, if it's just for national security issues, that's a whole separate discussion. But just if it's about bringing jobs back to the US, I take a neutral stance as a professor, but we have to think about, okay, what are some of these unintended consequences to public policies? And here we saw a sizable amount of job loss. We saw that GDP actually was thought to have shrunk a bit because of these tariffs. The trade deficit was worsened because of these tariffs and these retaliatory tariffs, and the difficulty of exporting American-made products. And so that's not saying tariffs are good or bad. That is just we want a better understanding of what happens when we engage in international economic policy. Okay, thank you. Thank you for watching.